Welcome to another episode of Projects in Focus. My name is Reece Dempster and I'm the host. I'm here today to bring the final stage of the project lifecycle, closing it out and handing it back to the asset owner. Today we are joined by Richard Wales, and if you like how we are doing this and presenting this information to you, please like, share, and tell a friend, as that brings us the ability to bring in more projects and more people to have a conversation and share their lessons learned through their journey. Today, we are diving into a critical project that was a keystone element of the Perth CityLink project, the Perth Bus Port in the CBD, and how that was handed over back to operations became a very good success story across not just the Public Transport Authority, but also for Perth in general. To help us on this journey, we have been joined by Richard Wales. Richard has over 35 years experience in delivering infrastructure across the world, and he's here to talk today and share his experience as we dive into the Busport. I first met Richard back in 2018, working at Public Transport Authority, and ever since we've been staying in touch and having some really good conversations around projects and what they mean for Perth here in our state. Richard, welcome.
Thanks for inviting me, Reece. I appreciate the opportunity to have a chat about my favourite subject projects.
Richard, what is closing out a project to you and how important?
I think there's different facets to it. So it's not just one aspect of a project. And that often causes problems in itself. From a project team perspective, a lot of the time you're reaching the point of testing and commissioning. You've got an eye at the end of the project that you're going to do commercial closeout. And then for some of the other stakeholders, it's all about cutting the ribbon, turning the thing on, and getting it to work. And it really depends a lot on how the project team views it and those stakeholders. Where's the area of focus? You've got to really deal with all of those issues. And that's one of the challenges.
What's your favorite project to talk about in terms of handing it over when you've done, not the one that we're here to talk about, but your favorite project of all time?
I think I've got a lot. There's ones that I've been involved in a lot of detail, and there's ones that I've come in at the last minute to try and help. Early in my career, my probably biggest experience was on West Coast route modernisation in the UK. We had a very firm time. Richard Branson wanted to run his new Virgin trains at high speed on the West Coast main line. And we had about probably a dozen or more individual projects that made that up. And what we had to do was achieve that objective of running the train, but we also had to keep the existing railway running effectively. We had to hand over assets that were going to last, some of them 40, 50 years. And we had to make sure that each of those commercial contracts were closed out effectively. So very complex. I was quite young at the time, and we were making decisions on a daily basis. And so there's a real buzz and excitement when you reach that stage of a project. Being involved in testing and commissioning is probably one of the best learning opportunities. It's you're out there 2 a.m. in the morning and things are happening. You got to deal with them, and then at the same time you got to make some strategic decisions around what's important and what's not. So I would look back at that early in my career as a great learning experience. But out of all of the projects, I've learned something probably from all of them.
Fantastic. That's a really interesting thing that you've just said there, that potentially, early on in your career, maybe starting at the end of projects and diving into that part might be a good place to start. What have you thought? What are your thoughts on that?
I think I was lucky in that my first experience was in maintenance. So I'd worked with British Rail, had a very good sort of graduate training program, worked around all the different departments. And then my first job was actually looking after assets. So I heard all the war stories of projects that had gone wrong, legacies of things that didn't work.
Yeah.
And that was a good place to start. And then being sort of plunged into what was Europe's largest construction project at the time. And after the demise of Rail Track and the creation of Network Rail, there was a real crisis feel.
Yeah.
And often crises are great opportunities because people are looking for change, looking for different things. And we worked very well with Bechtel as a program management organization that were brought in to deliver it. And that experience of coming in at the end, seeing the challenges, but then also working with great people to solve them, gave me a huge amount of experience.
And not only that, everyone has a buzz at the end, don't they? They have this, we've been doing this for so long, and now we see the light. We're at the end of the tunnel. You don't have to look for the light. You're almost being blinded by it, but you're trying to get out of the tunnel, essentially. Like, there's such a buzz. What is exciting about that for you? What key part of that handover end stage?
I think on the best projects, the key is everybody being aligned with the same objectives. So if you've got a team of people, whether it's the designers, the contractors, the clients, all focusing on a particular objective, then you form friendships and relationships that perhaps you'll have for life because you're all working together. And that's when a project's really successful, is if you can get the alignment of the objectives across all the stakeholders. So things like the 2012 Olympics, great example. Everybody knew the date, everybody had to work to it, everybody comes together. And yes, there's going to be commercial issues, there's going to be personality clashes and whatever, but everybody is really pushing for the same thing. So when you work on projects like that, you come away with a great sense of achievement and also a great sense of being part of a bigger, broader team.
I agree. Fantastic example of, the key excitement is about people aligned, ready to finish this at the finish line. Yeah, absolutely. What is your view on the importance of getting to the final stage and then doing it right? Essentially, the word finishing strong. How important is it?
A lot of projects go wrong at the end. I think, and I've got into trouble with some contractors when I've said to them, doing the civil engineering is easy. So building the tunnel, building the main structures, that's the sort of basic civil engineering stuff, and it's probably 80-90% of the value.
Correct.
My view's always been, actually, that's easy. It's the systems, the integration, joining it up as a railway that's challenging. So I think when you look at sort of how important that is, the last stage of a project can, and I've got clients in parts of the world now that have had projects that were meant to last 4 or 5 years, they're now 10 years in. Huge commercial claims, huge issues. And it's often they went into the project not realizing how they were going to come out at the end of it. I was taught by someone a French guy who'd worked for SNCF all his life. He said, you need to plan for the commissioning. You need to have a testing and commissioning engineer on day one of your project so that you're thinking of what testing and commissioning is going to look like. Because testing and commissioning is often when you stress your asset the most. So you do overspeed tests, you work with equipment out of service, you do your emergencies. All of those things happen in testing and commissioning. If you don't design, build, and think about that phase, when you come to it, it will all go wrong. So successful projects think like that. They think about the end. They think about how they're going to transition. The ones that go wrong tend to think about how they're going to build it. And so they go, okay, I've built it. But quite often it then goes wrong, and it's years and years and years of delay. And unfortunately, far too many projects end up in that place.
And it's echoing another person that I like to read, Dr. Stephen Covey, junior and senior. And one of their things that they constantly push is begin with the end in mind. You don't necessarily need to have the exact plan and step all the way through to the end, but have the end in mind when you do your strategic planning at the beginning, because that will make the journey, a lot easier to narrow in your strategy. Because as we both know, strategy is more about what you say no to, and what is not going to be included in the project is probably more important than what you are going to include in the project. What is your thoughts on that type of mentality?
Absolutely spot on. I think if you think in those terms, then you start to manage your requirements better. we've ended up in a situation where a lot of our projects now have these huge requirements management organizations. Often the organization managing the requirements is bigger than the engineering organization. And what that has as a danger is losing sight of the end. If we focus on the 100 or so requirements that are needed for the project to be a success, and we focus on them at the start, build your organization around delivering them, build your designs, focus on those, then we'll come out the end well. If we drown ourselves in 10,000 requirements and we have vast spreadsheets and systems, we delude ourselves into thinking we're managing requirements. It's actually the key requirements that come out the end, and we've got to absolutely nail them at the beginning of the project. Too many projects haven't nailed those requirements. They get halfway through, start to engage some of the stakeholders, who then start to look at the project and go, I'd rather it look like this, or I want this. And often those stakeholders are very powerful. And then you end up changing your project halfway. And the impact of that is vast, not just in terms of cost, but also program, morale. It has a huge impact.
Absolutely. And I've been in a few projects, as of you've spent 2 years going down a particular pathway, and then you've been told to pivot. That it would have been nice a year and a half ago before you got to that stage. Have you got an example where you were able to get over that and still deliver an example where you got told to pivot, but then you're like, all right, here we're pivoting and now we've delivered?
Yeah, I think there's some good examples of projects that I've been involved in where rather than pivot, I guess it's probably refocusing.
Oh yeah.
So you find a project starts to drift. I go back maybe to that West Coast route modernization example. The project had incredibly ambitious aspirations. So higher line speed, higher capacity, new technology, and it was not going well. There was no real guiding mind on where the project was going to go. The consultants had sort of taken over. They were running down their own individual sort of routes. There was alliances set up that were sort of self-sustaining beasts that were uncontrolled. And as a result, that project had blown out to sort of £12 billion at that point. And there's some interesting reports that go into the detail of what happened there. I think what was successful in, let's say, pivoting was to refocus everybody's mind on a single objective. We were there to run a train to a timetable, and that was it. That was the objective. Safety, performance, and time, and by getting everybody aligned, we were able to ditch some of those requirements that had been created as solutions, and by ditching those and focusing on that single objective, we were able to pull everybody together.
Awesome.
And that happened over a period of weeks or months, really. Once we put in place a team with clear decision-making authority, we were able to cut through a lot of those problems. And I think that's a model that can be applied to a number of projects that have gone wrong. It's something I've suggested on a number of projects that have lost their way, is create an organization with decision-making authority and clarity, so that you have one single guiding mind on, I'm not saying one individual person, but someone who makes decisions for, say, track, signaling, some overall sort of vision of the project. And I think when you do make that pivot, or you have to refocus, or there's a change, and that often happens in the life of these big infrastructure projects will last 10 or more years from when they first get conceived. You will often have a number of pivots during that time as different focuses emerge, and you have to tackle those and not allow the project to just drift and wander.
It's interesting. You're saying the same thing that came from two of our previous guests. One, Richard Hughes from ECU, Professor Richard Hughes. He was talking about realigning with benefits and making sure you're consistently your requirements are still meeting the benefits, and then making sure you're doing that. And then Chris Carmen, who was talking about bringing your design team to authority, so that when they're building their design and developing into a scale, the people with authority are right next to them, able to support that integration of progress into the requirements that you need. A lot of projects kind of sometimes set themselves up with their authority on the right and the design on the left, and there's a lot of tick-tacking between the two through whatever contract mechanism that's been set up. But sometimes we need to overcome that. So it's amazing how you're like repeating that same sentence or that sentiment even today. How important is it to, in that final stage, to check, have you hit the benefits?
I think it's essential, but you have to do that throughout the life of the project. So your classic sort of V-cycle stuff, where each stage of your project, you need to decide, have I met the outcomes? Again, it's not 10,000 requirements in a big doors database that you need to focus on. It's, have I met the outputs? Is this going to give me the capacity I need? Is this going to meet stakeholder requirements? Is it going to be maintainable? What's it going to look like over 40 years? Those are the things that you need to look at throughout the V cycle. And you need to be checking off at each stage that you're going to meet those. Because coming to the end and then realizing you haven't met one of them, it's very difficult to recover from.
So I know what you mean by V-cycle, but could you dive into what that means for some of the listeners that may not?
Yeah. So in standard speak, EN 50123 is the 50126. Is the international standard for railways. In COSI is the systems engineering organization, and they have a V cycle, and it originates from sort of aerospace and systems projects. And the idea of the V is at the top on the left-hand side of the V is where you start your concept. You go down the left-hand side of the V as you develop that concept into more detail. And as you come down the left-hand cycle, you reach the bottom where you actually start building. And then up the right-hand side, you start to test it, commission progressively from each individual component all the way up to a system. So if you imagine your V, each of the layers of the V correspond from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. So I go all the way down the V into the detail. So I'm into boxes and connections and real sort of small componentry level. I'm buying bits and pieces from around the world, and I come up the right-hand side of the V and I'm putting it all together into a complete railway system, bus system, oil and gas system, where all the parts have to work together. So when we talk about the V cycle, it's about deconstructing a big concept of a new railway or a new complex system. We break it down into all the components, and then we build it back into that system as we construct it and commission it and pull it all together. It's a very useful way of thinking, and some people have turned it into a cottage industry, but I think thinking in that cycle terms is really important. And often people then tag on to the right hand of the V, a little leg that's called operations, maintenance, disposal, and that hits us for the whole of the asset life.
Fantastic. And thank you for sharing that, because people don't always understand what a V cycle is. I'm trying to educate just on a project life cycle, but the V cycle is a very good tool that can help communicate where we're at, what we're doing within that type of project. So no, I appreciate that, sharing that information. What is the, I'm going to start segueing in it. You've had a lot of rail experience. what was your involvement in the Busport project in the CBD, and how did you get involved? So rail experience coming over to the bus side. What happened there?
Yeah, it's quite an interesting one there. I moved to Australia in 2014, so the bus project was underway, as you say, part of Perth CityLink, which is a great overall program of activities to help sort of invigorate that area of Perth. And you can see, obviously, with ECU campus, it's an awesome outcome there. So I came into it when that was already underway. My role in the Public Transport Authority was the General Manager of Network and Infrastructure. So that role was looking after all the assets. And an interesting part of that is that it was the rail assets that I was responsible for. So why would I be responsible for Perth Bus Port? And the interesting thing there is, and it was a debate that happened within the PTA, who should look after that asset, because we've got plenty of other bus assets that Transperth look after. The reason that the Busport was treated as part of my portfolio was because it was linked into the Perth transport hub, really, in the centre, where the Perth Underground Rail had been quite recently installed. That had fire, life safety systems, a whole load of quite complex systems that needed to be coordinated. The Busport similarly was an underground facility. With an underground facility, you have certain complexities. And it was felt that the Busport made sense to fit into that Perth precinct and be managed as a holistic asset within that network. So it was new for me. I hadn't dealt with a Busport before. And it was an interesting sort of clash of cultures as well, because you had the railway people and then you had the bus people. And there's always some interesting, I guess, tension between those two groups.
Yeah, and both sides have some amazing people. I've been on both sides as well. It was always a good little integration effort that needed to undertake. How did you? So, what stage of the project did you come into it, and what was the project at that stage to you? So when.
Yeah, well, I think when I arrived, the sort of diaphragm walls were going in, and it was right in the heart of the construction. So I had the good fortune of being involved during that construction phase, getting to know the project team. The PTA had their own people in there as well, so it was running as an alliance, quite a successful alliance, I think, where you've got the combination of all the key parties working together. As we said before, having a clear single objective is important. And I think that alliance was good in that sense, that the objective was clear, and there was involvement from all the key parties. Some really good leadership. Project director was very good from the alliance, and the behaviours, I think, worked really well to pull that team together. So I was lucky enough to be involved in that construction phase, and then through into entry into service, completion, and then looking after the asset on an ongoing basis.
Awesome. So give us a bit of a scope overview. What was the Busport project? So the Busport project.
Okay, so in simple terms, it's putting a new bus station in the middle of Perth.
Yep.
Yeah. So that was the objective. The challenges of that, there's a multitude of challenges. One is, where do you find space for it? So you're trying to develop the centre of Perth. You're trying to create commercial opportunities. Obviously, you can see the ECU campus there today. You don't want a big bus port sitting there, so you hide it. And that's basically what the design has achieved. It's all underground. You barely notice it exists. And that's a good outcome. You want the transport hub in the place that it's most useful, which is smack bang in the middle of the city, but you don't want it taking up a whole load of space that could otherwise be used for commercial or other opportunities. So that was the concept. We'd already put the railway line underground. So the railway line was hidden out the way, and that freed up space. And then in putting together the Busport, it was known from the start that the likelihood would be that there would be some very big buildings going over the top of it. So it had to be a Busport, but it also had to, from a civil engineering perspective, form the foundation for a very large multi-story building. And at that time, nobody knew what that building looked like, knew what the design was going to be. So there had to be some smart thinking around, what provisions need to be in that design, and they thought that through well. The other thing was the challenge of a Busport in the middle of the city, and space. So one of the technological innovations with the Busport was dynamic stands. So what that means is you don't always go to stand number 2 when you get your bus to Fremantle. The system is designed to optimize the use of the bus stands. So there's a limited number of stands due to the space, and the system is designed to go, okay, I've got a space at X, I'll allocate that space to, the bus to Fremantle. And as a result of that, you can put a lot more capacity into the facility. And that was, I think, I'm right in saying that was the first use of that technology in the
Absolutely.
Southern Hemisphere. So it was quite an innovation, and quite a systems challenge. And there were some issues with that, as there is with any innovation. But what that meant was that we didn't have to create a huge footprint as we would have had to otherwise. So it was quite challenging. I mean, the challenge of being a railway person going into that is it's a bus stop. What's the difference? But actually, it's quite a complex systems project, and one that obviously has been in operation successfully for quite a number of years now.
Yeah, hidden away and everyone forgets about it, isn't it? I was walking through there the other day, and it's still looking very neat and tidy, and very useful for how ECU, which is now going to be directly above it, with students coming in and accessing the CBD. How do stakeholders play a part in the closeout stage? We're not talking about authority people within the organisation. How did the external stakeholders play a part in that final stage with you?
Well, from my perspective, I was interested in the assets. So that's one aspect. But the important part of it really is the users of the facility. So that's Transperth, with the bus drivers, with some of the people who've got businesses in there. Obviously, there's a need to operate the facility, so it's got a control room, and getting them involved early was important. So they had to understand how that facility was going to work as part of the wider bus network, and there was a lot of work went into that, and so they were very much involved from the start, and then through into the whole operational readiness, getting it ready for operation. So they were key stakeholders. There was the businesses as well. There was a lot of disruption to the businesses in that area during construction. And then what did that look like in terms of that wider sort of precinct area?
Fantastic. How did you, what mechanisms were you putting in place to make sure that they were engaged?
It wasn't something I did,
Okay.
to be fair. It's the Alliance had a whole team that were looking at stakeholders.
Yep.
So they had a communications team, and they had their own stakeholder team, and they were in place from the start of the project. So, stakeholders during construction is different to stakeholders during entry into service and completion. So they had to deal with ourselves from a rail point of view during construction, because they were building very close to an operational railway. They had to get materials in and out. All of those things are disruptive to the centre of Perth. So that part of stakeholder communication during construction is very different to the actual entry into service and operational readiness, where you start to talk to the operators and find out whether the buses are going to fit, how they're going to look, how does it flow within the wider bus network. So managing stakeholders is a huge challenge. I'm used to it on rail projects, but a bus port like that has as many or more stakeholder challenges than a rail project.
One stakeholder that a lot of people tend to forget about in especially projects of significant nature is the firefighting and response of first responders. The Busport has an interesting story behind it, about engaging the fire brigade and having to test and demonstrate that it all worked. Can you give us a bit of an insight what happened there?
Yeah, any underground facility has a challenge with fire. And in Perth, there isn't that many underground facilities. And that's, since I've been here, I've seen that grow. So the Perth City Link, the rail part was one of the first facilities. So that's got quite a complex fire and life safety system that's linked into the fire and emergency services. And that has to be quite comprehensively tested. And the Busport was another challenge to that. So the Busport is a completely independently designed system, but it also has to fit into the Perth precinct. So there are some crossovers. For the fire service, it's a new thing to be working underground. And whilst the rail kind of introduced that, the Busport, I guess, took it to a new level. The main reason when I look at it is you're putting a bunch of, as at the time, diesel buses, gas buses into an underground facilities. There had been some issues with gas buses in Perth for anybody who's been in Perth for a while. Fortunately, we've got a lot more electric buses, which are the way the world's going. And managing one of those fires in an underground facility with a lot of people is obviously a key issue. And there has been fires. There was a fire at EQ in the bus port there. The ability to fight a fire was a key part of the design. And actually the design changed over the course of the project. I'm not a fire design person, but the way that fire designs are done is through combination of looking at standards, modeling, and then adopting certain practices around setting up the facility with different fire zones and managing your smoke, and it's quite a complex area. So like I say, the design changed from the original concept to what was put in there at the end. And we actually ended up with something that was simpler and easier to operate at the end than what the designs had originally configured. But yes, key stakeholder. And there's probably a separate episode on fire and FAL and the airport link, because that's, as you can see, I think in Melbourne at the moment is having some challenges with the approvals for firefighting in suburban rail loop. So yeah, you think of it as just a small facility, but actually it's a very complex facility. If you've got a dozen buses in there, all with either gas or some form of fuel. And even when we talk about electric buses, the batteries on electric buses, there's been a number of significant fires and incidents on those. That will be something that facility has to manage for the foreseeable future. So it's not just what it does today, but, was it designed with a battery fire in mind? Those are all the things that when you design a facility like that, you've got to take into account.
And they had to test it as well. There's some pictures there of everything being turned on and showing that everything works as intended. And there's some pretty good examples of a stakeholder that you don't think will play a big significant part in your project all of a sudden becomes someone that can shut you down.
That's right. No, that's absolutely right. And fire is an interesting thing. Smoke doesn't necessarily behave the way the designers think it's going to behave. So where you create positive air pressure to drive the smoke away and protect people, does that work in the real world when you test it, when doors are opened or people behave in ways that you don't expect them to? So yes, you have to design it, you model it, and you go through lots of processes, but actually testing it's essential. And not just on Busport, on a lot of projects, you'll have a dispute around how much testing needs to be done.
Mm-hmm.
So on the one extreme, we'll go, we need to have a fire. Let's set a bus on fire and see if it works.
Yep.
Probably not the best idea. But on the other hand, just turning it on and seeing that all the alarms come on and work is not sufficient either.
Yep.
So you have to have some level of simulation. You have to try and make sure that, again, it's the V cycle. It's the top sort of right-hand side of the V. When you've built everything, you've tested the alarms, you've tested that all the fans work and all the different parts of the system work. You've got to test it as a system, often for things that you hope will never happen. Major fires, floods, things that you hope will never happen. But the system's been designed and is expected to manage those. So you have to find a way of testing and validating that those design features are fit for purpose. So for the Busport, and to give the people of Perth who use it every day some confidence, there was a comprehensive set of fire testing. And there's hot smoke, cold smoke, which people in the fire world will argue about the relative merits of the two different types of tests. Both of those were used to confirm that the system that's there today will be safe in the event of a fire. There's a deluge system there, which went off accidentally during testing, and we can prove that it creates a lot of water to put out flames and manage the risk. Yeah, and because that's what it's about. It's about, you're not creating a perfect environment, but you're managing a risk.
Yeah, and that risk element is really interesting. Some people think, it's only a chance of a fire. And it's like, well, the chance of a fire in one-off situation is like playing lotto. But from a regulator and a state agency's perspective, we're playing lotto every time a vehicle and person enters a location. So, when you play lotto 50,000 times a day, all of a sudden, when you've played that for multiple years, there's a very high chance that you'll have at least one event in a 10 to 20 year cycle. And that changes the risk perspective very quickly. With risk in mind, and you've got a very unique perspective of this because you're both asset and project orientated. So you've got that, you've got the understanding of the value needed at that end stage in handing over the top cycle of the V. How do we create value for project managers that don't necessarily have that experience? How would you communicate the need to add value to that closeout and finishing strong project manager? How would you do that?
There's a couple of questions in there, isn't there? So I think the risk one is an interesting one. There's a recent study from the University of Toronto, which is looking at how projects around the world, mainly rail projects, and that one was focused in Canada, why they're so expensive. And they looked and they found one thing in common with the projects that have become particularly expensive in the last 20 years, and they found they were all English speaking. So not that they were a developed world, third world or anything like that, or technology, but simply that they were English speaking. And one of the areas that they found was about management of risk. So if you go to the fire example, or a good example in Canada, was the specs that they used for tunnels were much higher than, say, the Spanish, the Italians, or some of the other countries they compared with, because they wanted a tunnel that had no water ingress at all.
Oh.
Yeah. Or there's another case where they wanted separation between the two railways, again, from a fire perspective, because it reduced the risk. The impact on cost was phenomenal. So it drove the cost. And in this case, some of the costs are sort of 60% or more higher in those countries than, say, Turkey, Spain, Italy, where their railways seem to be working well, and by all accounts, they haven't cut corners on safety. But that risk aversion that has prevailed in a number of those projects hasn't necessarily had any benefit. It's just driven up cost. Now, there's a whole research piece on why there is risk aversion, what's driving that risk aversion. But what it does is it's early on in a project, you're finding a lot of risk-based decisions are being made, and the designers are erring on the side of risk aversion, where actually risk can be better managed at the end of the project, at that phase that we're talking about, which is entry into service. So I was involved very early on in Taiwan, in the high-speed railway in Taiwan. There's a great contrast between that project and High Speed 2 in the UK. So High Speed 2 in the UK, famous bat tunnel. So there was an issue over bats. So they've created a tunnel at £500,000 for the bats. They've put whole sections underground because of stakeholder concerns. And it's just completely blown out in terms of cost. If you look at Shinkansen, to some extent, TGV in France, they tend to go, I'm going to build this line, and then I'll deal with the consequences at the back end of the project. So I'm not going to try and design out every risk and make everybody happy at the front end. I'm going to build the railway. I'm going to have a budget that says, okay, that hospital's affected. Yeah, so EMC issues, electron microscopes, all those things have been affected. I'll build you a new lab. And actually the cost difference is huge. So managing risk at the back end more effectively and planning for it, I think is good practice in project management. We find out that a lot of assurance activities are done at the front end of a project. So you'll have design, checked, approved, independently verified, separately verified by the client. Often a third-party stakeholder gets involved. So you've got all these layers of assurance at the front end, and then when we come to test, commission, enter into service, there's often very little equivalent assurance being carried out or risk management being carried out. So I think there's a great opportunity to do the way the Japanese, the French, and some other countries, not English speaking, how they manage projects, and to learn how they enter things into service and how they manage risk at the back end.
Wow. That's fantastic insight. And it's very interesting because, you know, a few light bulbs went off in my head while you were saying that. We are very heavy up front in terms of project risk management, and then very light on the other end around the handover, and how do we make sure that there's no bad stuff at the handover stage. But yeah, it's a very different perspective. Thanks for sharing. What diving back into Busport, what was one of the key, I guess, risk management activities that you had to undertake before you could say, let's putting some buses through here?
I think we covered probably the biggest one for me will always be safety.
Yeah.
So you can't put into service something where you think it's unsafe or that the safety risk is not acceptable.
Putting the safety aside, commercially and project management activity wise, we're not talking about the alliance here. We're talking about some of the things potentially PTA had to do to make sure that they're ready to.
Yeah, so it's a good point. So the good thing with Busport was it was ramped up. So unlike some other projects that I've been on where they want to go 100% on day one, it had a sort of a slow burn. So you have to do driver training. So you got to put a certain number of buses through there just to get the drivers familiar. So there's a number of stage gates that you can put in place to get to your eventual full operating capacity. And by doing that in a staged way where you've got clear milestones, clear pass, fail criteria, then you're able to progressively build confidence. And whether that's just putting the first bus through, you can do that without the whole everything being in place. You don't have to have everything finished, everything shiny, everything signed off. You can have a minimum criteria to just do some of those initial activities, and that progressively builds confidence. And that involves the stakeholders like Transperth, the drivers, the operators of the facilities, the security staff, all of these people can start to get involved before it's finished. And you're not at that point of substantial completion, which is a hot topic for projects. What is substantial completion? And I know on Busport, like a lot of projects, I remember saying, I don't care about substantial completion. That's your problem as a project. I'm interested in hitting those milestones for entry in service. Substantial completion then gets linked typically to some of those operational sort of milestones. But it's very different and a different concept to operational readiness in itself.
Absolutely. And what would be, so what was one of the elements in, not necessarily substantial completion, but the ramp up that you liked about that compared to some other projects that have been hard? Why did you like that ramp up?
I think it gives you the ability to deal with problems. Your difficulty with the Big Bang is you're all focused on getting a particular milestone, a single milestone achieved. And however much you try and, build things in the background to test and so on, if you're hitting it with one date where everything's got to be at 100%, things never work that way. Yeah. So one of the challenges in Canada is they have this concept of revenue service demonstration, where you've got to run it as if it was in full operation, but it's got to be fault-free. So, and that becomes very much, well, what does fault-free mean? Whereas if you run it like we did with Busport, where we put the first bus in, it works. We then put in a series of buses, and then we start to run different scenarios. So what happens if a bus breaks down? What happens if we have issues with the passenger information? And we just build progressively the complexity of the operation, and we're then able to overcome problems. Or we identify a problem and we go, okay, well, that's not going to stop our testing because, let's say, stand 4 is not working properly. Okay, well, we can still test without that. In the meantime, we can repair the problem. If you do the Big Bang, if stand 4 is not working, then you're stuffed. Mm-hmm. Because you've designed it around full capacity, or certainly near to full capacity. So building up has a multitude of benefits. One is that it gives the project team the opportunity to identify issues that are important to the stakeholders and focus on those and resolving them. It also then gives those stakeholders the ability to understand how they're going to operate and how they're going to behave with a facility that's often brand new operating concepts, and they've got to adjust the way they operate. So I think it's the best way of bringing something into service. Not always easy to do, say in a railway context where you bring in an asset and it's either in or out. But where you can, I think building it up like that is a good way.
Fantastic. So 10 years down the track, what is now available today that wasn't available back then that you think would have probably benefited the closeout stage, or project managers should be aware that they'd be using right now?
Sometimes I think going backwards is better. I'm not sure actually that we've progressed very well in how we close out projects. I think in some ways we've made it more complicated. So maybe we should go back 10 years and look at what was successful in the Busport and see maybe we could do some of that today. I think just talking to people who are involved in some of the cutting edge projects, there's a lot more use of digital technology nowadays. So I was speaking to someone last week on, not in a rail environment, but a new hospital where they're using augmented reality so that the users can walk through the end, literally pushing a trolley through the building. I think what that does is it helps those stakeholders to experience what it's going to look like before it's built. And because they're able to do that, the issues that they might raise at the end of the project, which can be game changing are addressed earlier on. So I think that technology used well can make a big difference. Yep. And so, if we use the example of firefighters, if we're able to create those scenarios and we actually do a fire in a tunnel and go, okay, this is how you've got to rescue and this is how much oxygen you got left, and let's run it as a real 30-minute scenario. If you're able to do that at the design phase of a project instead of when you're doing testing and commissioning, it might mean that the complexity of some of that testing and commissioning can change. So that's where I think things that are moving at a lot of pace technologically now could certainly help us.
Mm-hmm. How does, while we are talking change digitally will affect all stages of the project, how do project managers, take the lesson learned from 10 years and apply that to the digital element coming out? From your perspective as an asset manager, what's more important? Is it engaging the digital element or making sure you've got something ready to go? Like what's more important these days?
I think it's a combination. It kind of goes back to that sort of cliche IT, people, process, technology. You've got to get that balance right. Often the people part is the bit that gets missed. And people haven't suddenly changed in the last 10 years. Yeah. So we've probably got too much process now, and we've become dependent on processes. We think processes solve our problems. And then the technology, I think, is a great enabler. So I would say if we go back in time and we look at some of the great projects I've been involved in, it's always been about people. Mm-hmm. And I think going forward, it'll still always be about people. And it's about getting a balance between those three aspects. I think the projects that I've seen gone wrong, they've relied on process, or the processes they've had are not fit for purpose. And they haven't focused on the people and getting the right people in the right place at the right time to make the right decisions. And I think the lesson from the Busport was we had some really good people, both on the project team, within the stakeholders, not just within my organization, but within Transperth and others that stepped up, took ownership, made decisions, listened, had mutual respect for each other. And that doesn't matter whether it's 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that's a people thing that endures through time. I think the processes, I talked about the V-cycle, a lot of the processes, we talk, systems engineering is probably a whole separate topic area, brings a lot of good things, but also has the danger of bringing a lot of bad things where we think by having process, we've actually solved the problem. Without the technology, without the people part, the process won't help you.
And I'm 100% in agreement. My whole model of engaging projects is around people, as there's too many models out there engaging about process and IT. So I'm trying to focus on the people side of it within the projects, and I completely agree. How do we've talked about some of the lessons learned now. We've talked about some of the things that are available now compared to what was available 10 years ago. If you could say one key thing that you think all project managers should take out of the Busport in a handover process, what was that one thing from your perspective?
I think it's understanding what that process looks like at the beginning. So not thinking about it 6 months, a year from when it happens, but actually when you start your project. So one of the things on a lot of projects I get involved in as a consultant is I'll say, what's your acceptance criteria? I'm not interested in your requirement. How do you demonstrate that that requirement's been made? What is your pass fail? What is your acceptance criteria? What will it be that will ultimately stop this project being accepted? So I think understanding early on, again, it is about people and process in that sense. What is my process that's going to allow me to enter this into service and complete the project? And who are the people that are going to do that? So who is going to accept? do I need someone, the chief fire officer, to be down there to accept it? Or do I need an engineer with a PhD in fire that's going to accept it? Who is going to accept it? And what is it that's going to need to be met? And understanding that early in the project, I think, is absolutely essential. And the people who were involved in Busport, a lot of that was new to them. Some of them went on to other projects in Perth, and I know they valued that experience, and it helped them in the projects they went on to.
Fantastic. And that's so critical. And in that final step, having a confidence in that acceptance process and who's going to be accepted as a project manager. If you don't have that confidence and you're about to go into your closing step, that's where you need to put all your effort, essentially, as you get to that stage. Richard, you're talking about the critical element of how designers and contractors kind of come together. What is your view on that, and what are you doing about it?
I think it's absolutely critical for all projects, and that's why for the past few years I've been involved in some research at Curtin University. There's some really great people there. Peter Love is the professor there who's got a wealth of experience on major projects. Just written a book actually about the successes in Melbourne on level crossing, and I think that's, I'll plug his book, but it's a really great book that talks through how that project evolved over time and how that turned into a success. And it's also and just that particular area was something that the teams in Perth who are doing the level crossing replacement, they looked at Melbourne and built on that. And I think that project here in Perth has been an incredible success. My area of focus is, and it's something that's interested me for a while, is that relationship between designers and contractors. I've worked in both areas. I've worked for design organizations. I've worked for contractor organizations. And it's always fascinated me how that relationship works, either successfully or with some pretty catastrophic failures. And I've been looking at that from the perspective of social identity theory, which, if you're not familiar with, is really looking at how groups form. So I identify as something, and then I end up attributing certain characteristics of that group. So designers, and that's part of the research, is do they actually identify as designers, contractors, or even as a track engineer or a signaling engineer, and the extent to which they create that social identity for themselves. Others create that label for them, and then they create a view of, well, I'm a track engineer, you're a signaling engineer, I have these attributes, you have these attributes, and they create those often problematic relationships because of that. So social identity theory has been around for a while, often used in situations of race, religion, and those things that we're probably familiar around in terms of stereotypes, but not a lot of research has gone into the project environment, and can that be problematic in a project environment where you have designers probably, and this is part of the purpose of the research, to look if my hypothesis is supported by evidence, which is that designers behave in a certain way, contractors behave in a certain way, and that's detrimental, or if they behave in other ways, can be productive. So if we go back in time, there was the concept of the resident engineer in civil engineering, which would be an engineer, qualified engineer, who would be on a hut somewhere on site, and the person digging the hole would come to them and say, we've just hit bad ground or something's happened, and they would redesign it there and then, and the problem would be solved. Now, I think the world's moved on. I don't think the construction environment is as simple as it was 20, 30 years ago. So I don't think you should just go back with rose-tinted glasses, because that's another psychological phenomenon of looking back with everything was great. I don't think that's the case. I think the world has moved on, and what we need to do is look at those relationships. Are designers able to get out into the environment that they're expected to build for? We said earlier lots of assurance and a lot of activities happen at the design stage, not so much at the construction stage. Are contractors empowered enough? Some of the early feedback on the research is quite interesting in that the designers have a view the contractors have got too much power, the contractors have a view that they don't have enough. But we have people out in the field doing things, and I know this firsthand from a project I was involved in where we had the railway shut for a period of time. We were single line running. There was something we found as a design problem. We got a very competent designer on site. We came up with a solution within a couple of hours, and then we're told it's going to take 2 weeks to go through the assurance processes. There's no way that should be the way it works. We should be able to empower our contractors to do an appropriate level of decision-making within their capability. And similarly, we should encourage our designers to take the necessary risks to the benefit of the project. So it's quite a complex topic.
It is.
And I'm really keen to understand a bit more about it myself, which is why I've chosen to research it. I'm thankful for Curtin University in supporting that, and quite a large number of very senior and experienced people have offered to help me with that research. So big thanks to all those people, because hopefully from that research we'll be able to understand that topic in a bit more detail than kind of my simple mind has tried to assess it so far. We'll do some quantitative and some qualitative analysis, and hopefully we'll come up with some ideas of how we can improve that relationship and projects more widely.
So to help you on your research objectives, what would you need from people to help expand your quantitative and qualitative data set to be a part of your research?
Well, we're starting out with a questionnaire. So there's a questionnaire going out to about 40 or 50 people, half of them in Australia, the other half internationally, a mix of designers, contractors, clients. Some of those people have worked across different areas, and their insights are very valuable. Some people have worked in different countries and different roles. And so the questionnaire will be the first stage. That will give us some data that we can analyze sort of quantitatively. And we'll see if there's any strong correlations from that. And then I think the interesting bit will be when we get into the surveys and speak to some of those people with that expertise to understand what's underneath that. And what, not just things that have gone wrong, but where's the success been? And we can look in Perth, and there's some great, like Busport that we've been talking about today. I think that was some great success. The designers there and the contractor worked well together. They had a few hiccups along the way, as they always will. But I think at the end of the day, that came out very well, and we can see that with a number of the Perth projects here. In fact, Perth's got some great opportunities to do compare and contrast. Some very successful projects and some that have had challenges. Why is one different to the other? And then looking internationally. So those are the two elements: the questionnaire and the survey. And if people are interested in being involved in that, we'll certainly welcome any feedback or input. If people have got particular examples. We also want to look at the end of that research on how we apply some of the outcomes to new projects. If there's one of the things we've looked at is ISO 44001, which is a standard for collaboration. It's being used quite widely in defence. There's an Institute for Collaborative Working in Australia, and there's a number of organisations that are part of that. Hasn't really moved into the major infrastructure project space. So I think we're both very interested in projects. There's some real opportunities to build on success.
And how do people get in touch with you if they're interested in what's the best method to get in touch with you if they're interested in supporting your research or getting involved in your research?
LinkedIn profiles there. That's always a good way to get in touch. My emails, richard.wales@andromedaglobal.com. That's my business email. Either of those are great ways of getting in touch. And keen to get people's experiences and input.
Awesome. I'm definitely following what you're doing in that space. So thank you for sharing that. It's really interesting, and I look forward to seeing what you come out with at the as you get closer towards that
Yep.
conclusion component of your research. Uh, Moving into the final stages of the episode, we've had a really good conversation around closing out a project, some of the key elements that are in a project. What are you looking to achieve over the 2026 as it unfolds, in terms of where are you going to be? What are you targeting?
It's going to be an interesting year, I think, 2026. So on the one hand, I've got a number of jobs which is helping lawyers on expert witness activities for things that have gone wrong, which is interesting work, but probably not, an indication of things going well. So I'd like to be more involved in some successful projects. So there's Rail Baltica, which is a fascinating project, hoping to get involved with a Spanish contractor on that. Two reasons it's interesting. The Spanish contractors work very differently to the English-speaking contractors. So I'm keen to understand why their projects are often cheaper and maybe different is a better way than just saying that they're better, because I'm not sure there's anywhere that's got it perfect yet. And I think I'd be keen to learn from how they operate. And the Rail Baltica project's a fascinating project, particularly in light of the war with Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine. That project's got a lot of European funding. It's a multilateral project, so it'll be good to get involved in that. Keen to get involved in projects in Australia. At the moment, is actually not involved too much in Australia, but there's some things that we're looking at, and not just the project space, but also asset management. So it's an area that really keen to get back into. Helped do some work. Great organisation in Adelaide, Keolis. I've got an awesome team there. I really enjoyed last few years working with them. And the good thing is we've got some really good young people that are taking that forward. So it'd be great to find something similar like that, where we can be part of building a really good team.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, best of luck. And, in terms of today, it was a really good conversation. There was a lot of lessons learned that people can pull from. So thank you. That brings us to the end of another episode. Not just another episode, the end of the first season. It's been a fantastic journey as we've dived through 5 different projects and had a look at some of the things that happen under the hood. If you've enjoyed this season so far, please like, share, and tell a friend as we launch into season 2 shortly. We're going to dive into a bit more of project-specific elements through the different stages. So this season was a bit more of a general introduction of each of the stages. Next, we're going to be diving into some of the finer elements. And then we've already started planning season 3, where we shift gears completely and dive into the ITC world. Thank you for being a part of the journey through to the end of season 1. It's been a fantastic conversation along the first 6 months of the business as we've launched it. And we look forward to trying to help project professionals as they progress through their career, and not only just into their career, as they find themselves and developing their skill sets as they apply them to projects that are not going to be drying up anytime soon. We've got some of the biggest and best years ahead of us in terms of projects coming online in Perth across many different industries. And I look forward to having those conversations with you over that period. This will be airing in March, so I will be doing my normal from the month of March, which would be attending the PMI. The Scope Creep Social will be on the third Wednesday of the month of March at Market Grounds in the CBD, and I look forward to seeing you there and having a conversation. While This is the end of season 1. It's the beginning of a whole new season coming, and I look forward to sharing that with you. Thank you for being a part of the conversation, and have a good day.